Hello, my name is Ezenwa Ungbanu, and the topic of this discussion is resolving menstrual disorders naturally. Now, the menstrual cycle refers to the series of changes that occur in the ovary and in the uterus for the purpose of sexual reproduction. Now, it's a tightly controlled and coordinated series of events, and it's controlled by a chain of command known as the hypothalamal pituitary gonadal axis. Now, the elements in this hierarchy or chain of command are as follows. At the top of the chain of command is a structure in the brain known as the hypothalamus. You can see this great reproduction of the female form, and clearly this is the brain. So there's a structure in the brain known as the hypothalamus. It's the integrator of most hormone systems. It sits at the top of most hormone systems in the body, not only the menstrual cycle. So the hypothalamus sends signals to the anterior pituitary gland, which is another structure in the brain. It's a gland, and it secretes various types of hormones, not only hormones related to the menstrual cycle, but in this instance, it secretes hormones that impact and initiate changes in the ovaries, and then the ovaries now secrete hormones that have effects on the uterus, also known as the womb. And it's a bidirectional chain of command. So the information does not only flow in one direction, from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the ovaries to the uterus. There are feedback mechanisms from the ovary to the pituitary, from the ovary to the hypothalamus, from the pituitary to the hypothalamus. So it's a complex interplay of various hormones and negative feedback mechanisms that keep the cycle well balanced, well regulated, and everything just goes smoothly like a finely controlled orchestra. Something of that sort. It's a high degree of orchestration. So that gives us a little insight into a menstrual disorder. Since we recognize that the menstrual cycle is the complex interplay of various hormones, and a menstrual disorder is essentially a breakdown in that complex interplay. So when there are imbalances in hormones, when there is a disruption or an excess or a deficiency of certain hormones, it will lead to menstrual disorders. So the menstrual cycle unfolds over the course of an average of 28 days, but it varies. You could have a cycle that is 21 days or a cycle that is as long as 35 days. So, and that all falls within the range of normality. So the 28 is the average. And as I said, the menstrual cycle is the series of changes that occur in the ovaries and in the uterus for the purpose of sexual reproduction. So what are some of these changes? Well, the ovaries contains thousands upon thousands of follicles. And in the beginning of the ovarian cycle, because I forgot to mention, the menstrual cycle has two subsystems, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. But to try to divide them is a bit disingenuous because they're tightly integrated and they're tightly synchronized, which you will see. So the start of the ovarian cycle is the maturation of several of these follicles. There are thousands upon thousands of follicles in each ovary. And which ovary is involved in each cycle is kind of random. So there is no clear reason why a particular ovary is the one that is activated in a particular cycle, that is this 28-day period. But in one ovary, several follicles start to mature. And this is initiated by hormones upstream from the anterior pituitary gland. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to just focus on the ovary, the fallopian tube, and the uterus, and forget about the upstream elements. So the follicles start to mature, and it's like a race among several of them, but eventually one becomes dominant, and a follicle is the precursor of an egg. So that dominant follicle continues to mature, and the ones that failed in that great race atrophy and essentially wither away. So one follicle becomes dominant, it matures, and then eventually the immature egg called the secondary oocyte is released. And this event is called ovulation. And this occurs about halfway through the cycle, day 14. So the ovarian cycle, the first 14 days, is all about the maturation of these follicles and the competition among these follicles, and eventually one becomes dominant and is released in ovulation, and it's released into the fallopian tube, and it hangs around in the fallopian tube for 1 or 2 days, hoping to bump into that lucky spermatozoa. And if that doesn't occur, the egg withers away and is lost. So that is essentially the ovarian cycle. Well, not really. There's still more. Because when the follicle has released the egg, it's transformed into another structure called the corpus luteum, and it has its own functions, which I will get to in a bit. So that's the ovarian cycle. The race among the follicles, one becomes dominant, the release of the egg, and then that structure that is left when the egg is released, the remnant of the dominant follicle also plays an important role in the menstrual cycle, called the corpus luteum, the remnant of the dominant follicle. Now the uterine cycle involves the growth of a lining called the endometrium, which is a blood vessel rich lining. So the uterine cycle is the growth and the shedding of that lining in the event known as menstruation. So the uterine cycle begins with the shedding of the lining, and then there is growth of that lining. And it's coordinated with the ovaries very tightly, in that the follicles, as they are maturing, produce a hormone called estrogen. And right before ovulation, the levels of estrogen peak. Now, estrogen is what stimulates the growth of this lining. And eventually, after ovulation, the levels of estrogen fall off. And then the remnant of the dominant follicle secretes another hormone called progesterone, which stabilizes this lining. But when the egg is not fertilized and the egg withers away, the corpus luteum now recognizes that there is no need to continue secreting progesterone to maintain this lining, and it also withers away, and the levels of progesterone drop off, and the falling of the level of progesterone causes this lining to break down and to eventually become shed in the event known as menstruation. So the first half of the cycle is dominated by estrogen, the second half is dominated by progesterone. And it is the balance between those two ovarian hormones that are the key players in menstrual health. So what are some things that could go wrong? Obviously, it must involve an imbalance between estrogen and progesterone. Those are the common causes of most menstrual disorders. So what is an instance, or what might cause this imbalance of these two hormones? Well, the primary cause of most menstrual disorders is an imbalance known as estrogen dominance. Now, if we recall, the first half of the cycle is dominated by estrogen. This is day 14 midway. The second half is dominated by progesterone. Estrogen dominance means that instead of estrogen levels falling off, the estrogen levels are still at an elevated level, and this creates disruptions. Because, let me quickly draw the uterus once again, and associated structures, fallopian tube, ovary, ovary. So estrogen stimulates this growth. It's a proliferative hormone. It stimulates the growth of the endometrium, and then progesterone stimulates the stabilization of this lining. So estrogen dominance correlates with too much growth of this lining, and then you will have heavy flows, painful menstruation, you have irregularities just because there is a disruption in the normal growth and shedding of this lining coordinated by estrogen and progesterone. So causes of estrogen dominance. A major cause is xenoestrogens. Now, xenoestrogens means foreign sources of estrogens. Because if we split the word in two, xeno, just like you have xenophobia when you're afraid of foreigners, xenoestrogens are foreign sources of estrogen, that is synthetic estrogens. What are the major sources of these synthetic estrogens? Well, they're largely in a lot of highly processed foods. For example, commercial milk. Cows are fed a lot of synthetic hormones, most especially a hormone called recombinant bovine growth hormone. This hormone promotes cows to grow quickly, and it promotes milk production in dairy cows. The unfortunate thing is that this synthetic hormone, recombinant bovine growth hormone, ends up in the milk, and when a lady, a girl, a woman consumes commercial milk, it tops up the levels of estrogen in her body, because this is a foreign source of estrogen, and recombinant bovine growth hormone has estrogen-like effects. So it alters the curve, and menstrual health is all about the normality of your curve. First estrogen dominance, then progesterone. But when you add in foreign sources of estrogen, that the slope, the shape of the curve is altered, because you have higher levels of estrogen for longer, and that creates imbalances that manifest as disorders. So commercial milk is a major culprit because of synthetic growth hormones, which behave like estrogens in both male and female bodies, but obviously menstrual cycle pertains to females. So commercial milk. Additionally, tinned foods, all tinned foods, because the interior of tin cans, they are lined with what they call epoxy resin. But when you store something that is acidic in a tin can, the acidity of what is stored causes the epoxy resin to leach out a certain chemical called BPA. So I would say tinned foods / BPA, because the chemical that we're concerned with is BPA, also known as bisphenol A, and it's caused by when you store something acidic in a tin can, the acidity causes the BPA to leach out of that epoxy resin lining, and it now becomes part of that food, and when you eat it, you ingest BPA, and BPA has powerful estrogen-like effects in the body. It's a powerful xenoestrogen, and it also alters the shape of the curve. There's too much estrogen in the body. So tinned foods, by the action of BPA, then also drinks in PET bottles. Now, PET bottles are basically those clear bottles in which they store soft drinks, fruit drinks and all kinds of drinks and things of that sort. And the problem is similar to the problem with tin cans, in that plastic bottles, when you store something that is acidic within them, it causes a chemical called phthalates to leach out of the plastic bottle into the drink. So drinking soft drinks, drinking fruit drinks, fruit juices and pep bottles also tops up your body with xenoestrogens. And highly processed food is really at the heart of the problem, because you can see that in modern times we have a lot of menstrual disorders, both premature puberty in both males and females. So in young girls, they have their first menstruation called menarche at younger and younger ages, and that has to do with too much estrogen in their systems, even before their body, their sexual organs have matured to start producing estrogen to now stimulate their first menstruation. They have been receiving synthetic sources of estrogen for years, and they now reach sexual maturity at a much younger age. And it's an imbalanced sort of sexual maturity, putting them at much higher risk of many conditions later on, even cancers, fibroids, and whatnot. So xenoestrogens are a major problem. Another problematic thing that causes estrogen dominance is too much body fat. Now, in the body, estrogen is produced in 3 places largely. It's produced by your ovaries. That's the major source of estrogen. Estrogen is also produced by your adrenal glands. Now, your adrenal glands are 2 glands that sit on top of both kidneys, and your kidneys are located in your mid-back, and they sit on top of your kidneys. That's also a source of estrogen. Another source is body fat. So when you gain weight, when you're overweight, you have a higher proportion or a higher percentage of body fat. So you have more estrogen producing fat cells, because fat cells also produce estrogen. So too much body fat leads to additional estrogen secretion, and that also alters the curve, alters the relative balance between the first half and the second half, between the estrogen dominant phase and the progesterone dominant phase. You now have an extended estrogen dominant phase, and that leads to problems. So too much body fat is another cause of estrogen dominance. The final cause is chronic emotional stress. Chronic emotional stress causes estrogen dominance through a different mechanism. Because when the body is under chronic emotional stress, it produces stress hormones to help the body cope with the effects of emotional stress. Because emotional stress has real and tangible effects on the body. It literally breaks down structures in your body. So your body releases stress hormones known as corticosteroids, such as cortisol, to help you cope with the effects of chronic emotional stress. But the problem is that the increased requirement for cortisol and other corticosteroids causes your body to divert progesterone. So when your ovaries are producing progesterone, your body converts some of that progesterone to cortisol to help you cope with chronic emotional stress. That also alters the curve. So you have less progesterone and then high levels of estrogen. That also leads to estrogen dominance. So there are 3 causes. Xenoestrogens, which basically means foreign sources of estrogen tied to highly processed foods. Then you have too much body fat, because fat cells also produce estrogen, leading to estrogen dominance. And then chronic emotional stress, when your body converts progesterone towards cortisol, then you have low levels of progesterone. And you know, it's all about the ratio. So even if you have normal levels of estrogen, but you have low levels of progesterone, you still end up with estrogen dominance. So solutions are obviously tied to these three causes that I mentioned. It's important to reduce consumption of highly processed food, most especially conventionally raised animal products, both your commercial milk and then also conventional beef, poultry, egg, fish, because they're also laced with a lot of these growth hormones and with a lot of other synthetic chemicals that could behave like estrogens in the body. In addition, too much body fat. Well, it's most important to not so much emphasize on reducing the amount of food, but improving the quality of food. Because when you eat more whole foods, more natural foods, increase your intake of vegetables, varieties of vegetables. When plant foods, highly nutrient dense plant foods, become the core of your diet, you would naturally start to lose weight, and the composition of your body will be altered. You would have less body fat. And I think it will take care of itself, because when you eat more whole foods, some of the hormonal imbalances that result in excess weight gain will be dealt with, and then you will notice a reduction in appetite and whatnot. Because it's been found that a precursor to becoming severely overweight and eventually obese is a condition called leptin resistance, and that's tied to high levels of high consumption of refined carbohydrates. High consumption of refined carbohydrates deranges your leptin signaling in your body, and leptin is what tells your body that you're satisfied. And when your body doesn't respond to leptin, you eat more and more and more. That's the problem with things like foods with refined sugar, foods with white flour or refined carbohydrates. So your soft drinks, your pastries, your white bread, all these carbohydrate-rich foods, they eventually cause you to become leptin resistant, and then you lose control of your appetite because your body can no longer respond to the leptin signal telling you that you're satisfied, all your cells are nourished, you keep on eating, and then you now become overweight and obese. So when you eat more whole foods, you now resensitize your body to leptin, and then gradually you will notice a reduction in your appetite and a reduction in your weight, and just your metabolism, your fat burning capacity, your energy generation will increase just because of the higher availability of nutrients which are necessary, your vitamins, your minerals, your phytonutrients that all work together to burn fat and to just raise energy consumption in the body that will help you manage your weight effectively. Chronic emotional stress. Well, there are various mechanisms through which one can manage emotional stress, through prayer, through meditation, and through other techniques. Well, I'm not going to go too much into that, but I guess the important thing is just to recognize how being stressed out on a day-to-day basis could also impact menstrual disorders. Now, as a final note, I would like to also let you know about some research that has to do with the role of phytonutrients in resolving menstrual disorders. Because, for example, like fibroids are a manifestation of estrogen dominance. Because if you recall, estrogen has a proliferative effect on the uterus. It stimulates the growth of the lining. And what is fibroids? It's just a growth of connective tissues within the wall of the uterus. It's too much growth signal. So in addition to a very thick endometrium, when there's so much estrogen, there is so much stimulation of the uterus that other growths occur in addition to the endometrium. The muscular tissue of the uterus also starts to divide and proliferate and causes fibroids. What we have found is that there are various phytonutrients. For example, a class of phytonutrients called catechins, which are very rich in like green tea, are effective at shrinking fibroids and also resolving many menstrual disorders generally. So a useful intervention would be to drink raw vegetable juices like your carrots, ginger, garlic, tomatoes, various green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale. You grind them all in a juicer or in a blender, and then you sieve them, and then you drink that raw vegetable juice that is phytonutrient dense. That is a very, very simple way and very, very effective way to deal with menstrual disorders generally, and even severe cases like fibroid. In addition to obviously reducing consumption of estrogens, managing your weight, and managing emotional stress. I hope you found this talk useful, and thank you so much for your time.